She was right, Tharafal said, with some clear disturbance in her voice, before slowly sliding her claw along her personal assistant's screen and cutting off the call, and the really quite convincing imitation of her brother's voice with it. This is rather unsettling. It was a good thing that her sibling had managed to inform her about his stolen devices shortly after it happened, because otherwise she would have had a very hard time making the simulation out to be a fake. A rather unnerving change of fate to have an entire mode of communication turned on us, Konglorsh confirmed her thoughts, with a deep uncertain bellow. The thought of having to question every single call they would get from now on, as long as they couldn't know definitively that the device of whoever was calling hadn't been compromised, was anything but comforting. Not only because of the possibility of being deceived, but also because of the exact opposite possibility occurring. Any request for assistance, any call for help, even any social call, it would all be questioned from now on, stealing valuable seconds in the worst of times if bad came to worse. What was also disturbing was the timing. The election's end was close at hand, and the chance that any of this was going to make a big or even noticeable change in the result was rather low, and their enemies likely knew that much. Therefore, he assumed that this was a rather clear message that the conflict was not going to end with the results, no matter what they were. Of course, they knew that that was most likely going to be the case already, but now, they basically had their declaration of war. He closed his eyes briefly, and allowed a long breath to escape from his lungs. Well, at least we're not going to have to be so careful about what we say from now on, Tharafal suddenly said in a passing manner, causing Konglorsh's eyes to shoot back open to stare over at the Parascene. What do you mean by that? He asked, his mind so deep in his own thoughts that he found it hard to immediately follow her path of thinking. Tharafal made a dismissive gesture with her hand, that ended in her half-open palm pointing up, while the whiskers poking out from the back of her mask gently swayed through the air. I mean, with this sort of tech, they can have recordings of us saying whatever the void they want, she then said, her beak slightly clacking as she spoke some of the words, subtly indicating to the Tenashasite that her dismissive demeanor wasn't quite what it seemed. Which means even anything we actually say that fits into their agenda isn't worth anything anymore. If they want to expose it to the world, we simply haven't said it. Konglorsh tilted his head. Quite bold of you to claim that we should lie quite so brazenly, he remarked, unsure what exactly to think of her words. He generally had a good deal of respect for the representative of his galactic neighbours, so hearing her speak so comfortably about simply disregarding the truth was odd. Tharafal clacked her beak once more, though deliberately that time. It was a loud, hollow sound that likely travelled quite far. Our opposition has been doing it for quite some time. I don't see why we would have to take everything they wish to deal out against us on the chin, she replied directly, her tone not aggressive, but carrying a firm emotion that was clearly aiming to convince. Although it is an admirable wish to stick to nothing but the truth, there is nothing inherent about the truth that would give it any more power than a sufficiently well-told lie, as we have seen many times in this past year. I am certainly not going to sit there and allow them to use out-of-context snippets of things I said to try and drag me through the mud. Not when they are trying to lure me into a burning death with the voice of my brother like some sort of evil spirit. Konglorsh huffed. That was quite the comparison, though not entirely inaccurate, he guessed. I suppose I cannot fault you for that, he then concluded, after a few more moments of thought. Then his attention was suddenly caught by a gentle scraping sound, causing his eyes to shoot down to the table between them where it originated. The longest of Tharafal's claws was just in the process of pushing the large bowl she had been occasionally grabbing scraps of meat out of for the duration of their conversation over to him as he caught it. Two of his eyes remained focused on it, while the other two moved to look up at her instead. I'm stuffed, Tharafal quickly stated, and demonstratively laid her free hand onto the lowest part of her upper body to give a visual to her fullness. Would you finish the rest? I don't want it to go to waste. Konglorch sighed a long exhale, as his main focus was pulled onto the remains of what was little more than an appetizer in the first place. Almost immediately, the sight of even those meagre scraps caused his twin hearts to begin to drum faster, seemingly battling against each other in an uneven rhythm, while vague but recognizable images flashed through his mind in an instant. Meanwhile, Tharavel gave him an innocent look, pretending like she didn't know exactly what she was doing, which the Teneshite obviously could see right through. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate it. However, with a morose exhale, he hesitantly reached into the bowl, picking up one of the shorter scraps with the very tips of his claws. He caught himself holding it, almost like one would reach for something repulsive that you barely wanted to touch at all, and he quickly forced himself to grab it more properly as he, now almost forcefully, yanked the meat up to his face. Though the quick burst of motivation was short-lived, as the smell of it suddenly hit his nostrils. On the one hand, it was incredibly appetizing, with many baked-in instincts of his body immediately reacting to it with an impulse of desire, especially after they had been basically starved for it for quite some time now. Yet at the same time, a more active part of his mind had an entirely opposite reaction, immediately fighting for control over his body, as it tried to make him wrench his head away from the source of sustenance. He suppressed it, but it was not an easy task. With a few deep breaths, he prepared himself while he held the meat in front of his mouth, knowing it would just be one quick bite. Just one quick bite. Come on. Suddenly, his personal assistant went off, loudly announcing that a call was incoming for him, and causing both his and Tharafel's gazes to shoot down to it. Konglorch, maybe a bit too quickly, let his hand sink back down and place a scrap of meat back into the bowl so that he could take the call. What did the human say again? Saved by the bell? Looks like they may be trying with me as well, Konglorch mumbled at first, trying to distract from the slightly miffed expression that Tharafel was giving him over his over-enthused change of topic. Although, as he took a moment to see who was actually calling him there, that idea pretty much vanished from his mind. Picking up the call, he briefly cleared his throat. I was afraid I too would fall victim to one of the recent botted calls, he then said instead of a greeting. I guess I was half right. A somewhat amused tone, akin to a courtesy laugh, came from the other side of the line. If only you were the first one to make that joke, Avesalon then fully replied, sounding not quite as annoyed as the sentence may have indicated, even though it was always a bit hard to tell how much her tone actually reflected her state of mind, considering that she created it entirely willingly, much unlike organic voices functioned. But yes, that concern is on everyone's mind at the moment, which is also why my dear boss has decided to communicate with you through me, since I don't have a phone or other device that could get stolen in order to imitate me. Konglorch exhaled slowly. That makes sense, he replied, as long as you are sure that was actually Zishadi talking to you. Please. Avesalon quickly shot back at that, sounding honestly a little indignant at even the implication. Just because your flesh ears are easily fooled does not mean I could quite so quickly fall for a language model. Give me a little credit. A slight bellow escaped Konglorch's chest, but he decided to keep any rebuttal to himself. Right, he said instead, and kept his voice calm and direct. So, what does the acting councilman want from the likes of me? Apparently, there is need of some extra large hands, Avesalon replied rather straight out, to help with the decorating and stuff. Apparently, he doesn't want to leave it to anyone he hasn't personally vetted. Would you and Tharavel possibly be interested? Konglorch took a moment to glance over at the Parasine. Tharavel rolled her eyes slightly behind the mask of her beak, seeming to put it together that Konglorch would very much use this as a chance to escape. But in the end she gave a dismissive but ultimately approving wave of her hand. We will be there, Konglorch therefore confirmed without missing a beat. Where does the councilman need us? At the main hall, Avesalon quickly informed. Apparently it was decided during the last meeting that the conversation would be taking place there instead of on one of the public stages. Immediately, Konglorch's eyes narrowed slightly, and he wasn't alone. Despite her begrudging posture, Tharavel lifted her head as well, as that information sunk in. "The main council hall? The large conference room?" she asked outright, speaking across the table as if she had always been part of this conversation. "They are simply going to let, Curie in there?" she asked with some serious doubt in her voice, after seemingly needing a moment to either remember the name of the cyborg she hadn't personally met yet, or to decide how exactly she wanted to phrase her question around them in a way that wouldn't sound like she was trying to insult them. "Considering how hard of a time many of them had even allowing a carnivore in there," Konglorch mumbled in concurrence with her surprise. "Did Zishadi have to fight hard for that?" "Zishadi wasn't the one who suggested it," Aveslon said, which didn't exactly ease any of the worries that were flaring up with the development. "Apparently, that honor fell onto Magistheria Tuya, and although she did have to put up some fight to get it through, I suppose it was far less of a struggle than Zishadi would have to go through for similar results." "Not surprising, considering her standing," Tharavel murmured through a clacking beak. "I suppose Kashalengas must have been her largest obstacle?" Hopefully that assumption was right, because if even he played along, something was most definitely wrong. Aveslon took a bit longer to answer that time. "He may have been, had he actually been there," she then finally stated, which left both of the large centaurs to tilt their heads in confusion. "He has been absent from all recent council meetings, ever since Zishadi did not step down from his acting position. According to rumours shared in the council behind held-up hands that offer little protection from Amiat's ears, he seems to refuse to stand on one level with a predator." That certainly made it harder to determine if he was in on it or not. Tharavel released a slightly chirping sigh. "To think that he was once a well-respected man," she lamented briefly, and shook her head, causing her whiskers to swing more wildly for a second, before settling back into their constant yet gradual wiggling. Then she lifted her golden eyes up to Konglorch's gaze. "You're probably thinking what I'm thinking, Venahasari?" Konglorch nodded and hissed through his sharp teeth. "The main hall. One of the few places where the humans may not roam as they please," he grumbled in acknowledgement. Anywhere the soldiers couldn't reach was a place that indicated danger. However, but also one of the community's most hallowed places. One has to wonder if they would actually be willing to besmirch it. "After attacking a founding core world, I don't think anything is holy to them anymore," Aveslon said categorically. There wasn't a hint of doubt in her voice. And why would there be? "You are most likely right," Konglorch confirmed, not seeing a point in trying to even ponder if there was another line that could be drawn. And even if there was, they would simply cross it again. "So, should I tell him you are on the way to aid in decorating?" Aveslon briefly followed up, to which Tharavel almost immediately rose to her full height. "Yes, we are on our way," she said, making the already made decision again, while clearly already waiting for Konglorch to follow up on it. Since he had already agreed, he didn't mind the enthusiasm and pushed up as well, though it took him a bit more effort than it had taken her. "I will inform the councilman," Aveslon confirmed, before hanging up the call. While Konglorch followed after her, Tharavel quickly got to work drumming up the necessary accompaniment of human soldiers, so that she and Konglorch could make their way to the main hall safely, even if the soldiers would not be able to ultimately follow them inside. The journey itself was comparatively eventless. Of course, there were the usual hecklers and nosy passers-by. However, by now most of them had gotten it through their heads that getting past the human escort was by no means an easy task, and that there was no hesitation on the local security's side when it came to handing out fines for people who didn't get the message that the people escorted were not to be randomly messed with. Given that neither Konglorch nor Tharavel were the main targets of the people's ire, that meant that they were at least largely left alone. Soon enough, they had reached one of the main hall's large entrances. Standing in front of it, they found themselves stared down by the oversized stone depictions of core worlder species, which also flanked them on both sides of their back. Estazai, Koiveri, Zanhathai, and Simareskis respectively eyed them, with petrified gazes of stern disdain, or at least that was how Konglorch's mind interpreted the unimpressed and determined faces the statues regarded them with. Though maybe his internal bias was playing a part in that. They announced their arrival electronically, and the even for them enormous door was quite quickly opened to reveal the view of a much smaller person standing with his hands folded behind his back. "So glad you could make it," Tshirt greeted, his voice speaking more of boredom than of actual excitement, while his tail swayed with the words, "Do come in. We don't have too much time until I will not have the sole liberty of inviting everyone in here anymore." With thankful gestures toward the soldiers who would have to wait outside, Tharavel moved to enter the room first, with Konglorch following closely behind her. Unlike the Parasine who had ever so briefly been a councilwoman, Konglorch had yet to see the main hall with his own eyes. Of course, he had seen it before in the news or in recordings of certain big events. However, stepping into the enormous hall and walking in between the large podiums of the current council, while looking up at the statues depicting the very first of its kind looking back down at them with their larger-than-life gazes, was something entirely different. Even the Tenashicide felt a certain awe at the rather oppressive aura the room provided. Almost like a weight was pushing directly down at him. "I asked..." Tshirt suddenly spoke up again, while slowly meandering along next to the Licitor, apparently having noticed his gaze up at the statues. "Sadly, we are not allowed to decorate doors as well." Konglorch couldn't help but let out a laugh that was somewhere between amused and appalled. Despite the community's many shortcomings, he couldn't deny a certain respect for its ancient founders, and everything that it had ultimately achieved. A sentiment that seemed to be shared by Morgoth, who was already in the room and shot Tshirt a disapproving look at his joke, while using just one arm to hold Ajaxia high up into the air so that she could fasten a festoon made of simple, yet sleek light fixtures to one of the podiums. Not exactly something that most people would have in mind when they heard decoration. However, Konglorch assumed that it was specifically picked to hopefully be to curious taste. "It's still extremely uncanny that they are letting us decorate this place at all," Konglorch couldn't help but comment, as he watched how one cyborg hung up a festoon in the council's main hall for the official meeting with another cyborg. It might have even been encouraging, if it only hadn't felt so incredibly like bait. "Indeed," Tshirt confirmed with a mild twitch of his ears, his tail swaying in Konglorch's direction, while his gaze remained forwards. "We better do our best to assure we can hold our own against whatever they have planned for us." "I'm assuming you have a plan," Tharavel chimed in, while taking in the rest of the room as it was being prepared for the guest of honor's arrival. In addition to Morgoth's and Ajaxia's efforts, Agia Fionora and Losarana were also hard at work, using their size and climbing abilities respectively to stick small individual lights of different colours to the various surfaces of the room. Meanwhile, Nuff mere dual friends stood nearby quietly, seemingly keeping watch over things. "Of course we do," Tshirt replied nonchalantly. "First step is to make sure we know this room inside and out." With that, one of his ears turned in Konglorch's direction, quickly followed by the rest of his face, as he looked up at the large lizard. "I think your eyes may be quite useful for that." Konglorch nodded and lifted his head, quickly beginning to scan the room, trying to commit it to memory. However, as he did so, one of his scanning eyes eventually caught the image of Tharavel, then a second one. Soon enough, all four of them were staring at the Parasine, sticking onto her face like to glue. The ambassador blinked in confusion before discreetly reaching up to run a hand over her beak in an attempt to remove a possible stain or mark that could have possibly caught his eyes. Though Konglorch didn't even truly notice the gesture, simply remaining in his now truly absent-minded stare, until Tharavel finally couldn't help but speak up. "Venahasari?" she began to say. At first, her tone sounded like it wanted to be slightly flustered, almost as if she wanted to interpret something into his stare. However, as the word went on, it turned away from the sheepishness and toward more of a sincere worry, as she seemed to notice that his stubborn gaze was far from a dumb stare. "Are you feeling all right?" The world suddenly came flooding in again, as Konglosh blinked with all four of his eyes. "Yes," he said in a reflexive reaction, before he had any time to really think about the question. "Yes, I'm all right." Even as he said it, the room spun before his vision ever so slightly, while he still took some time to refocus. "Just had a thought," he grumbled under his breath, before heavily shaking his head to the point that the plates of his body released a grinding sound as they rubbed against each other. Lifting his head up again, he tried to get back to his previous task, his eyes once again gliding over every minutiae the meticulously decorated room had to offer. However, the room's image was still gently swaying to his ears, and before he knew it, his eyes once again all fixated on a single, recognizable point, in order to prevent further nausea. This time, his stare had landed on Ajax's mechanical eye, though he caught himself just in time before his conscious thought would drift off again, while his gaze clung to it. With a frustrated huff, the Tnashasite reached one of his hands up to hold the side of his long head. Meanwhile, the large molars that formed his front feet aggressively opened and closed, scratching firmly at the ground as they did. "You don't seem all right," Tshirt immediately commented in a matter-of-fact manner. He tilted his head, his expression candid but showing only limited empathy as he asked, "Do you have a headache?" However, a loud clack from Tharavar's beak cut through the air before Konglosh could even attempt to answer, a displeased chirp escaping her lungs. "Probably more trouble concentrating," she said, her tone filled with equal parts worry and accusation as she took a few steps closer to the Tnashasite. "Feeling weak? Hard to focus?" Konglosh growled deeply as his eyes shot to hers again, her golden gaze easily holding his fiery glare. Of course he knew what she was getting at, but he really didn't need to hear it right now. "Venahasari," Tharavar began to say, but then shook her head for a moment and changed her tune. "Konglosh, the signs are quite clear by now. You cannot go on like this." Another growl escaped through Konglosh's teeth as he pulled most of his eyes away from the Parasine, with only one of them remaining, as he said, "Let that be my worry." A curious vibrating noise came from Tshirt as he watched the exchange, his ears slightly twitching as they turned from one to the other so he wouldn't miss a thing. "Not sure what this is about," he commented, as things turned quiet for a moment. "But if you do not feel up to the task—" "Just give me a moment," Konglosh half roared, the reply coming out far more aggressively than he intended, while he shot his large head around to loom over the rather unimpressed Deathworlder. With an annoyed sound that was directed at himself far more than at the acting councilman, Konglosh clenched his jaws for a moment while trying to get a grip, and one of his maulers heavily hammered against the ground with its knuckles. "I just need a moment to—" he tried to explain in a more controlled manner that time. However, before he got the full sentence out, he was quite abruptly interrupted by a sudden strike that flatly slapped against the side of his face. It didn't particularly hurt. However, in his current state, it was enough to make Konglosh briefly lose his focus, forcing him to shake his head for a second, before his eyes scrambled to find the source of the sudden assault. It didn't take him long to realize that, although he hadn't really paid attention to it at the moment, he did see how Tharavar slowly retracted her flattened tail, just after the sudden hit. Unlike a Tnashasite's, a Parasine's tail, with its thin, flattened shape, and the two hems of densely rowed feathers on its top and bottom side, which made it appear almost fin-like, wasn't exactly made for striking, never intended by nature to be used as a weapon. However, that didn't mean it wasn't enough to send a message. And as Konglosh stood there, staring at the offending spinal extension with some serious bafflement in his gaze, Tharavar inhaled deeply. She then lifted one of her front feet and brought it down onto the ground. Her stomp caused a hollow thwomp to echo through the large room, which quickly caught the attention of everyone in the room. Conglorch's eyes widened ever so slightly as he beheld the gesture. His mind immediately forced to wonder if it was what he thought it was. He didn't have to wonder for long, however, because Tharavel quickly lifted her foot once more, and then immediately brought it down again. She then proceeded to repeat the same process over and over, rhythmically stomping the ground with her large foot while the rest of the room fell quiet, and looked at her in curious confusion. That was except for Conglorch, of course. His body acted purely on instinct, with no thought on the matter forming in his mind for the time being, as he too lifted one of his large maulers, and began to echo Tharavel's stomping, joining in her even rhythm, while their respective feet slightly shook the ground, as they impacted it over and over like the beat of a drum. Conglorch's hands flexed open and closed, while his twin hearts began to synchronize with the rhythm, his eyes inadvertently narrowing at the parascene, as the two predators face each other down. Slowly but surely, their rhythm reached its crescendo, speeding up more and more until it reached a very particular speed, and then suddenly stopped. A deep bellow released from Conglorch's chest, and was met with a rumbling coo from Tharavel. Then, without another warning, the two centaurs suddenly charged at each other, like jousting knights. Conglorch was slightly larger, and had by far the most mass out of the two. However, Tharavel was faster, especially right now. Before they could collide with each other, the nimble parascene had swerved out of the way of the crash, quickly slithering past the Tenacious's attack, before pulling her path completely around and rearing up to push against the Licitor's backplates with her full weight, immediately causing him to tip sideways and stumble. As the room was already unsteady around him, Conglorch had some serious trouble catching himself. However, he managed to just about avoid ending up on his knees after the first attack. "Hey now, you two!" Nafmir Durlfran quickly yelled out, and began to make his way through the room, likely to stop the fighting himself. However, before he could make it there, his way was blocked by another large body, moving in front of him with his arm extended, and his tail flattened out. "Let them!" Morga firmly advised the young bull, shaking his head softly before turning it to look at the ongoing battle. Nafmir Durlfran seemed to be confused by that. However, something seemed to tell him that it would be right to heed the Ligomordalar's words, as he stopped in his tracks and simply began to observe as well, even though his cell-like ears picked up their constant fluttering from nervous tension. Morgoth released a long exhale as he looked on, his expression turning solemn yet carefully hopeful. "None too far, sister," he said quietly, as he settled in his stance. Meanwhile, Conglorch growled through his teeth while he laboriously turned on the spot, doing his best to keep up with the parascene's far more smooth movements as she began to walk literal circles around him. It was frustrating. Generally, a parascene wasn't expected to stand much of a chance in a direct, unarmed melee against a Tenaciocyte, and yet there was little he could do but defend himself in his current condition. "What's the matter?" Tharavel asked, as she continued her slow pacing around him, her golden eyes narrowed and ready for any sudden movements of his. "Feeling weak?" Conglorch couldn't help but let out a frustrated huff. "Are you enjoying this?" he asked, still needing to devote half his focus to even set one foot next to the other, as he was forced to turn on the spot, so she wouldn't get to his back before he could react. "Hardly," Tharavel replied, her tone clearly intended to egg him on, even if she didn't truly feel as cruel as her words made it seem. "I would have much more fun if you could actually fight back, and yet your loose plates are barely clinging to your meat." Once again her tail lashed out, weakly slapping against his protected side, without causing even a hint of damage. Still, Conglorch noticed his breathing becoming heavier. Not from the attack, but from the simple act of constantly moving and needing to focus on her. His own tail lashed out as well, and although it hit, Tharavel took the strike without much of a problem, apart from releasing a single, slightly pained noise. Conglorch, however, quickly paid the price for the strike, as he nearly lost his footing, as he threw his balance around to lash his tail out. Noticing that weakness, Tharavel was upon him almost immediately, once again charging against him, pushing with both her front feet as she brought her full weight down on him. This time she didn't leave it at a simple shove. Instead she kept pushing, and Konglorch wasn't quite so lucky to manage to fight himself to his feet again. As he fell, his tail lashed up once more and last time, delivering a heavy strike against Tharavel's head, which the cover of her mask quite handily absorbed, as most of the force glanced off from its smooth surface. Thus, her gaze was unwavering as she brought him down fully onto his side, while she stood victorious with her claws on his stomach. Of course, that's where it ended for her, as the sharp instruments of carnage laid on his skin harmlessly, without making any movements to push into it. For a moment, Konglorch could do little more than lie there and breathe heavily, each deep inhale lifting Tharavel along with it, as she kept her feet on him for a while longer.
"If this was that same day, you would be dead right now,"
she then stated, while looking down at him, not needing to elaborate on the meaning of her words, as she clearly waited for either his acknowledgement or his deflection. Konglorch panted a few more breaths before laying his head fully down onto the floor. "It is not that simple," he half growled, half lamented. Of course, he knew she was right. However, that did not make things any easier.
"It is not simple. It is a struggle,"
Tharavel confirmed, and finally pulled back and off of him, her claws landing on the ground with a gentle clack.
"A struggle for survival. You have to fight to stay alive. If you are not strong enough and can't get your next meal, then you will be even weaker to get the one after that, and even more weak for the one following that one. Missing just one can mean you're deaf in the long run, and the weaker you get, the less of a chance you have to fight yourself out of it."
She then walked up to him and reached her hand out to him, his eye moving up to the outstretched grasper with a weak gaze.
"But you are not hunting alone," she said. "You're not isolated in this struggle. We're all willing to share the spoils with you."
Konglorch released a long exhale, his body nearly flattening out against the ground as he let all the air escape his enormous lungs. "But I need to be ready to do the same," he said, with the last bits of oxygen remaining. Then he reached his own hand up, firmly grabbing Tharavel's and allowing her to pull him back onto his feet. Only once he stood tall again did he take another deep breath. His stomach was still far from settled, and the thought of what was to come next was still far from a pleasant one. Still, he looked down at Zeshadi with a renewed conviction in his eyes. "I am going to need a moment," he stated once again, although this time his words had a far different meaning than before.